This is the first time I've read minutes from the Federal Reserve that actually made me feel like they are blatantly trying to cover up their real concerns. Now, obviously, they're telling us them in the minutes, but I frankly think that's because they recognize the vast majority of people just aren't going to read the minutes. In fact, if, as usual, we just refer to what the mainstream media is telling us about the Fed minutes, what do we find out? We hear, oh, Fed to consider a gradual cooling of interest rates. In other words, they're kind of sending the signal, maybe the Fed will cut in December, maybe they won't, but the Fed feels like things are broadly balanced. Well, yeah, that is the impression that you would get if you go to page 13, where they say, all members agreed that the post-meeting statement should affirm their strong commitment to both supporting maximum employment and returning inflation to the committee's 2% goal. Great. But that statement implies that the risks to employment and inflation are balanced. But that is a complete lie compared to what they're actually telling you in the document if you go through and read it. I'll try my best to start with the juicy stuff. So we're going to start with page 8, and we're going to go in order here of some of the juice. First, while the staff reduced its assessment of the downside risks, they recognize that the incoming data could be heavily skewed, and that although labor market conditions today remained solid, it was possible that the easing in the labor market seen over the past 2 years could give way to a more pronounced slowdown in economic activity. This is a red flag. This is already the Federal Reserve telling us, things might get worse here. And they're not talking about inflation either. They're specifically talking about employment. Why? Because in the next line they say, the risks around the inflation forecast were seen as roughly balanced. No extra commentary on inflation there. Pretty much solely commentary on how all of a sudden labor could rapidly decline. And this is what Fed Goolsby warned us for as well. And we just landed here. He warned that once you have a beginning of a downturn in the labor market, it's really difficult to work your way out of that. So I want you to tell me if these Fed minutes sound balanced, because remember, at the end, they're like, oh yeah, let's just tell everybody everything seems balanced. But that's not what they're saying in the actual document. Listen to this. Participants cited various factors likely to continue downward pressure on inflation, including waning business pricing power. Folks, every single day in the Market Open live stream and the course member live streams when we're reading earnings calls, I keep talking about how everybody's PP is going soft. No business has good PP right now. Everybody's got weak pricing power. Small. It's all. This is like the greatest shout out I could possibly ask for. The Federal Reserve literally says, including waning business PP. When are we going to get to the waxing phase? I don't know. But anyway, the committee's still restrictive monetary policy stance, as well as well-anchored long-term inflation expectations. In other words, not worried here about inflation because pricing power is super weak right now. Some other comments on this. They talk about, what about those month-over-month movements that we see? They call those movements volatile, and they expect those to remain volatile, and that incoming data should generally remain consistent with inflation returning sustainably to 2%. Notably, in both core goods and non-housing services categories, prices were now increasing at rates close to those seen in the earlier periods of price stability. We are also receiving corroborating reports from business contacts that firms were more reluctant to increase prices, as consumers appeared to be more price sensitive and increasingly seeking discounts. Yeah, Black Friday is going to be a big tell. A lot of people wondering, what are those coupons going to be for Friday? Anyway, and everybody knows I'm the king of coupons. Anyway, some participants remarked that although increases in housing services prices remain somewhat elevated, they continue to expect that these would slow, with a subdued pace of rent increases faced by new tenants eventually reflecting in housing services pricing. So in other words, think about this. They're telling you, oh yeah, things are mostly balanced. Then they have a whole page talking about how good things are inflation, how things are basically like they were before the pandemic. And oh wait, what were they before the pandemic? Below 2%. Remember, they had to do flexible average inflation targeting to make us think that they were going to try to have inflation at 2% because we kept running at 1.7% because inflation was too low. And at the same time, they're like, oh, things could get really bad in labor really, really quickly. And even though things are good in labor right now, that could flip really, really faster. We're also lowering our 2025 to 2027 real GDP growth outlook. But don't let anyone say anything about that. I just locked myself out.
That's a very inconvenient timing. Stand by for commercial intermission as I get into this. Get yourself life insurance in as little as 5 minutes by going to metkevin.com/life. That's a paid promotion, metkevin.com/life. Over. Okay, moving on. So then, listen to this. Wage increases were unlikely to be a source of further inflationary pressures, which, by the way, was also remarkable because they were talking about how people, when it comes to getting jobs, are basically like, look, I'll take whatever work arrangements you want, and I'm willing to take a more moderate wage. They literally said this. Some participants reported that businesses were becoming more selective in hiring as they faced larger pools of more qualified applicants, and job applicants more willing to accept less accommodative work arrangements and more moderate wage offers. Participants generally noted, however, that there were no signs of a rapid deterioration in the labor market conditions, with layoffs still remaining low and businesses preferring to use attrition. That's for now. But what happens when the layoffs strike in Jan? They're talking about how not just businesses are having smaller PPs, but people are having less pricing power. Smaller PP at the people as well. The humanity, it's terrible. But then when it comes to talking about data that's actually potentially worsening, listen to this. In discussing labor market developments, participants generally viewed recent readings as consistent with labor market conditions remaining solid. Okay, that sounds good, right? But wait a minute. Although labor strikes and devastating hurricanes had been important sources of temporary fluctuations in the data, participants continued to cite declines in job vacancies, the quits rate, the turnover rate, as consistent with an easing in labor demand, and businesses becoming more selective as they faced a larger pool of more qualified applicants. Participants generally noted no rapid sign of deterioration yet, again because they're preferring attrition over layoffs at this point. However, and this is the interesting part, there goes Southwest, this is the interesting part, the Federal Reserve continued to be challenged with difficulties in measuring the effects of immigration on labor supply, revisions to data, there's that shout out. Remember the huge revisions we had to data over the 2 months, August and September? Terrible revisions that basically brought us from a pace of over 200,000 job gains per month first 6 months of the year down to about 100,000 jobs per month for the last 3 months, which is a massive decline. But anyway, listen to this. They talk about the effects of natural disasters and labor strikes among the factors complicating the evaluation and the assessments for outlook of the labor market currently being associated with, quote, considerable uncertainty, and the agreement that labor market indicators merited close monitoring. Notice how they're not saying that about inflation. They say nothing about inflation when it comes to close monitoring, indicators potentially creating elevated risks, additional risk that, quote, the labor market could deteriorate even further, though many participants see an excessive labor cooling as having diminished potentially since the September meeting. It still is an elevated risk. But wait a minute, the risk diminished since September? Hold on a second. What happened in September? Oh, that's right. We had 785,000 gains in government workers, likely polling workers. We already adjusted out the seasonal jobs for teachers. Instead, somehow we had a 785,000 job increase for non-seasonally adjusted, workers for the government, which is crazy because if you remove government workers, we would have been negative. In fact, even if you go to October, we were at negative 27,000 private payrolls. If it weren't for government jobs, we would have had a negative report. Of course, government jobs are going to go up before the election, and you can't seasonally adjust that because that happens every 4 years as opposed to every single year. So, using that data, they suggested, maybe the risks have diminished somewhat because, numbers weren't that bad in September. So you're getting this really weird messaging here, where the Federal Reserve on one hand is saying, everything's good on inflation. We do have problems with labor. Things could get really bad with labor. Let's talk about how good inflation is and how uncertain and how bad things could get with labor. But then, remember, at the very end of all of it, let's end with, let's just tell everybody in the statement that things are mostly balanced. In addition to that, they briefly mentioned how lower to moderate income households were having more struggles. This is old news. Higher credit card delinquencies, although auto delinquencies slowed a little bit. And commercial real estate
actually seeing a little bit of a moderation. Maybe it's by the dip time for commercial. They're suggesting that you're sort of seeing a bottoming out of the pain in commercial. Maybe HouseHack needs to start a commercial fund. Remember, go to househack.com if you want the 5% convertible. That ends December 13th. But otherwise, other than that, the Fed was pretty straightforward in trying to punt any responsibility of issues. A couple participants remarked there was considerable uncertainty about the durability of recent gains in productivity due to potentially transitory factors such as shorter-term productivity or artificial intelligence. How long is that productivity going to last? We don't know. We also noted some signs of deterioration, lessening in commercial real estate. I just mentioned that. And that's it. So if I had to summarize this in 10 seconds, I would basically say, Fed, inflation is cured. We have a lot of problems on labor, but let's tell markets that everything is fine on both inflation and labor and that those two risks are balanced, even though we're just going to talk to you in the fine print about how good everything is in inflation and how bad everything is in jobs. It's all good. And there you have it.